right now.
By Mr. Phil Thompson, Deputy Mayor of New York, and other distinguished guests. A decade ago, the General Assembly declared that 18th of July, Mandela's birthday, would be dedicated to his unparalleled service to humanity, from fighting racism, apartheid, poverty and inequality, to promoting human rights, democracy, social justice and peace. In 2015, the Assembly adopted standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, known as the Nelson Mandela Rules, and extended the scope of the day to promote humane conditions of imprisonment, to raise awareness of prisoners as a continuous part of society, and to value the work of prison staff. In keeping with a life spent walking the talk, Mandela Day is marked not by grand words or gestures, but by action taken by individuals in their communities. Later today, I and members of my team will be volunteering at the Brownsville Community Culinary Center, helping to prepare and serve meals. For so many people in this city, the UN can feel like something distant, so I am delighted that we can do something tangible to serve people in Brooklyn as we strive to serve the whole of humanity. Dear friends, in 2002, I had the privilege of meeting President Mandela during the Rio+10 summit in Johannesburg. I was struck by how his profound respect for human dignity was evident in every interaction with those around him. Last September, I convened the Nelson Mandela Summit to mark the centenary of his birth. Almost a year later, when principled, far-sighted leadership is in short supply, we feel his loss more than ever. But we can channel his spirit and honor him by carrying forward his legacy. We must increase our efforts to combat racism and hate speech. The special rapporteurs on racism and religious freedom have reported an alarming surge of racist propaganda and attacks on religious communities. Let us strengthen our resolve to fight this scourge using tools such as the Durban Programme of Action and the UN Strategy on Hate Speech, recently launched by the Secretary General. We must do more to address the lasting impacts of colonialism and slavery. As we enter the fourth year of the decade of people of African descent, we must recognize the many levels of discrimination and violence and abuse that they continue to face, as well as the structural inequalities that persist. This must be part of our strategy to leave no one behind. Mandela described overcoming poverty as an act of justice, not of charity. Madiba also declared that freedom cannot be achieved unless women have been emancipated. I firmly believe that empowering women and girls is as close as it gets to a magic formula for building more peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable societies. It is in this spirit and acknowledgement that our destinies are bound together, for good or for ill, that we must move forward. Ultimately, it is by delivering the SDGs that we can live up to the ideals that Mandela lived for, the ideals he was prepared to die for, the ideals of our United Nations. Those ideals demand that we do more to build a culture of peace, through conflict prevention and mediation, through peace building and sustaining peace, through arms control and disarmament, and through dialogue. More dialogue. Now, more than ever, we must follow Mandela's example and talk and listen to each other, to those we don't normally speak to those who are ignored and marginalized across borders, sectors, and generations. This coming year is our chance to make concrete progress on building the future we want and the multilateral system we need to achieve it. This is our chance to make the UN more effective, transparent, accountable, and relevant to the people it serves. From High-Level Week this September to the UN's 75th anniversary in September 2020, and key events in between, such as Beijing +25, we need to demonstrate greater trust, cooperation, and shared responsibilities in order to address the multiple crises we face, including climate, conflict, violence, poverty, inequality. There can be no better tribute to Mandela than being each other's keepers and stewards of the planet. As we contend with challenges old and new, let Madiba's legacy inspire us to act in a way that matches the ambition of our resolutions. And I thank you. Tengo ahora el honor de dar la palabra al secretario general de las Naciones Unidas,
Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Madam President, distinguished delegation of South Africa, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we commemorate the lifetime of service Nelson Mandela gave to South Africa and to the world. We pay tribute to an extraordinary global advocate for dignity and equality and one of the most iconic and inspirational leaders of our time. Nelson Mandela exemplified courage, compassion, forgiveness, and commitment to freedom, peace, and social justice. He lived by these principles and was prepared to sacrifice his liberty and even his life for them. Madiba's call for social cohesion and the culture of peace are particularly relevant today, with hate speech casting a growing shadow around the world. Last month, I launched the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech to coordinate United Nations efforts to identify, prevent and confront this shameful phenomenon, which is progressively infecting mainstream discourse. And in response to recent attacks on places of worship, I've also asked my team to develop an action plan to help safeguard religious sites. As we work collectively for peace, stability, sustainable development and human rights for all, we would be well served to recall the example set by Nelson Mandela. In this building, last year, at the September Nelson Mandela Peace Summit, nearly 100 heads of state and government, along with ministers, member states and civil society representatives, committed to intensify efforts to build a just, peaceful, prosperous, inclusive and fair world. The gathering declared 2019 to 2028 as the Nelson Mandela Decade of Peace, saluting Mr. Mandela for his humility, forgiveness and compassion, acknowledging his contribution to the struggle for democracy and the promotion of a culture of peace throughout the world. As we enter the first year of the decade, many conflicts continue with no sign of an end. The multilateral system we have built is under strain, and human rights are under siege from many quarters. In response, let us be guided by Nelson Mandela's courage and wisdom to stand up for the values and principles of the United Nations Charter. Our best tribute to a full life that Nelson Mandela devoted to the struggle for human rights is found in actions. As we do each year, the United Nations is calling on people and organizations around the world to mark the day by making a difference in their communities. This year in New York, the UN community, diplomats and staff members are volunteering to support social justice by cooking for and serving disadvantaged people in Brownsville, Brooklyn, a neighborhood that Madiba visited when he came to New York for the first time in 1990. Nelson Mandela's message to the world is clear. Every one of us can step up and act for enduring change. We all have the duty to do so. And on this day of reflection on Nelson Mandela's life and work, let us embrace his legacy and aspire to emulate his example. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement, and I now have the privilege to give the floor to Her Excellency Madame Mamoloko Kubayi Ngubane, Minister of Tourism of South Africa. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Government of the Republic of South Africa and the President, His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, it is an honor for me to deliver this tribute on what would have been the 101st birthday of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, a tireless anti-apartheid activist and a global advocate for human rights, peace, freedom, and justice for all. Today, like we do every single year since a decade ago, we gather at this August chamber, united in purpose and determined in a call to international community to take action and inspire change. This year, we commemorate the 101st anniversary of South Africa's first democratically elected president and a statesman, Nelson Mandela, under the theme, Action Against Poverty. It will be remiss of us not to pay tribute to the United Nations General Assembly and in particular to the President of the General Assembly as well as to Your Excellency the Secretary General for their leadership in organizing this important annual meeting. We also extend our appreciation to the Office of the Mayor of New York City, seeing the Deputy Mayor here, and the Brownsville Community Culinary Center in Brooklyn for their collaborative efforts with the UN in organizing a community outreach event in honor of Tata Madiba's vision. We will participate this afternoon in the distribution and sharing of warm meals with the less fortunate members of the Brooklyn community. We are humbled and inspired as Madiba's children by all the peace-loving people around the world who today will spend 67 minutes or more to take action and inspire change in many different ways in advancement of Madiba's ideals and values. Madam President, Nelson Mandela reminded us of the following regarding poverty. I quote, "Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is a man-made and it can be overcome and eradicated by the action of human beings. Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life," unquote. Madiba believed that all of us, no matter our background, can make a difference. He believed that every man, every woman, and child should take responsibility to change the world for the better. The United Nations, this assembly of the people of the world, in its historic efforts to address some of the challenging global issues of our time, adopted in 2015 the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals within its 17 SDGs. It is not by default that goal number 1 is eradicating of extreme poverty. The architects of the SDG, like President Mandela, recognize that reducing the number of people who live on less than a $2 a day will have a positive impact on the other aspects of human development and well-being. Your Excellencies, Nelson Mandela's vision and that of the 2030 Agenda recognizes that in creating a prosperous world that is at peace with itself, ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequalities, and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and our forests, is critical. While extreme poverty has eased considerably since the 90s, pockets of the worst form of poverty still persist, not least on the continent of Africa. In honor of the legacy and values espoused by Mandela, and in upholding the founding principles of this august international governmental body, we should, as member states, redouble our efforts in the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda. We must further utilize the International Nelson Mandela Day to interrogate and reflect on what more can be done to enhance our universal social protection systems and what sorts of targeted measures we can employ to reduce extreme poverty by 2030. Your Excellencies, failure to heed the call by President Nelson Mandela to take action and inspire change will be to reverse the gains we have made in making the world a better place for all. As we march towards the 75th anniversary of the United Nations next year, we dare not falter in our commitments and efforts as the international community to build on the gains of these key global milestones, which culminated in the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, with 17 SDGs at its core, at the UN Sustainable Development Summit in 2015. Madam President, as we celebrate Mandela, we reiterate our call for the United Nations to rededicate and reassert itself as premier global institution in the execution of its special responsibility to shape a world free of fear, want, and prejudice. We call on all nations of the world, developed and developing alike, to emulate Tata Madiba's values of tolerance, dialogue, respect, unity, and reconciliation, and to embrace his qualities of humility, forgiveness, and compassion, and his dedication to the service of humanity. We must recommit to the ideal of just, peaceful, prosperous, inclusive, and fair world. It is only then that, as the global community, we can decisively address extreme global poverty, which torments billions of people around the world. In honor of Nelson Mandela's values and ideals, let us recommit ourselves to take action and inspire change, and for this august global institution to take action against poverty as we stand on the cusp of the 75th anniversary of the UN in 2020 and towards achieving the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development Goal. In conclusion, on 24th September 2018 at the Nelson Mandela Summit, the General Assembly recognized 2019 to 2020 as the Nelson Mandela Decade for Peace. The Nelson Mandela Decade for Peace is a reaffirmation and tribute to Nelson Mandela's legacy, the values and ideals he fought for and stood for. He stood for 67 years as a servant of the people around the world. It is therefore appropriate for me to take this opportunity to call all member states of the United Nations, as well as the international community as a whole, to use the Nelson Mandela Decade for Peace to redouble our efforts in pursuance of international peace and security, development and human rights during this decade. I thank you.
Agradezco a la ministra de Turismo de Sudáfrica por su declaración y quisiera agradecer al secretario general por su presencia esta mañana
for his participation this morning. I would like to inform the members and our guests today that the Secretary General will need to leave at this time due to other engagements related to the high-level political forum. So we once again thank the Secretary General for taking the time to be with us this morning and bid him farewell. It is now my privilege to give the floor to Ms. Gay McDougall, Vice Chairperson of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, who will deliver a keynote statement. You have the floor, Ms. McDougall.
Thank you. To the Secretary General, who's just leaving the room on important business, to the President of the General Assembly, Excellencies and colleagues. It's a great honor for me to join you on this day that the international community and the United Nations honors the legacy of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela had a tremendous impact on the movement for racial justice around the world and on me personally. So while I could speak in the name of the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, I thought that I would make some personal comments. Millions who sought equality and dignity but were losing hope found inspiration in the struggle against apartheid and in the courage demonstrated by Nelson Mandela. He has taught us all the true meaning of freedom, and that freedom comes with responsibilities. In the few years of his life that he was out of prison, he helped free his whole nation from apartheid, and he restored the world's faith in heroes. I feel grateful for the honor and privilege of having known this remarkable man for a few years. He and I once shared a magical moment as we stood next to each other, or I stood next to him, as he voted for the first time in 1994. Sharing that moment created a bond between us that he mentioned every time we saw each other subsequently. Mandela's legacy is one that speaks to everyone around the globe who seeks justice, equality, and human rights. When I personally consider his legacy, 4 themes come to mind. First, Mandela's life teaches us about the power of personal courage and integrity. It's important, he taught us, to focus your life on matters that are larger than yourself, causes to advance social justice, equality, and the common good. And it is important that you be true to your principles even when it seems nearly impossible to do so. Sacrifices always come with commitment to principles. Courage is not the absence of fear. Rather, courage is the resolve to act in the face of fear. Even when the apartheid government offered to release Mandela from prison early, he refused to make concessions to injustice. So after 27 years, he walked out of prison proud, unbroken, uncompromised. The speech that he gave the day of his release reaffirmed the same demands he made to the government on the day over 27 years earlier when he was first sentenced to life imprisonment. Second, Nelson Mandela was a person of great humility, but at the same time, he had a tremendous, almost infectious sense of self-confidence and self-esteem. These were not competing qualities. He was confident about his values, and he was confident about his ability to achieve justice. But he eschewed egotism and self-aggrandizement. He was quick to admit his faults, and he wanted to be remembered as someone who had failings as well as triumphs. What this has said to me over the years is that while it's critical that one's life be guided by a moral compass, we don't have to be perfect to be heroic. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The opportunity comes to each one of us often. Third, Mandela's life also taught us lessons about leadership and the importance of collective action. He took every opportunity to make clear that his achievements were products of collective decision-making by a liberation movement that represented a popular mobilization among South African people. His role, as he understood it, was to be one among many. Mandela was a part of a whole generation of South Africans who rose to the challenge of emancipating their country. Their selflessness and readiness to serve their people with no expectation of personal benefit was truly inspiring. The names of many of those who were a part of that generation and gave of their selves to the movement, many of those names are recorded in the annals of South African heroes and sheroes. But unfortunately, the names of too many of them will be lost to history. Fourth, Mandela's life taught us powerful lessons, I think, about forgiveness and reconciliation. But the lesson he taught was not how he failed to be angry at those who jailed him unjustly for 27 years, because he was indeed angry. Rather, what was more important was that he was someone who had extraordinary vision and incredible discipline. He knew that anger could tear his country further apart, and that ultimately violence produced no winners. So instead, he chose nation building over revenge. He had a vision of what a just society entails and the commitment to an ideal which is more powerful than hatred. Excellencies, Nelson Mandela has left a challenge not only for South Africans, but for all of us who live in the wake of his life. Will we make choices in our lives and work, and indeed in the international policies made in this great institution, the General Assembly of the United Nations? Will we make choices that reflect the ideals of justice and the example of courage that are his legacy to humanity? I want to join the President and others. I think we're all on the same theme here. When I read this statement, one of my favorite statements by Mandela, but one that has particular relevance to the peace and development agenda that the General Assembly has before it now. Overcoming poverty is not a task of charity. It is an act of justice. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is man-made and can be overcome by actions of human beings. That's all of us, each and every one of us. I'm proud to join you all in celebrating the life of this great human being, Nelson Mandela. And I want to commend the Secretary General's initiative strategy on hate speech. I think that is absolutely something that has to be dealt with right now with courage and commitment. Thank you.
Doy las gracias a la señora McDougall por su declaración.
For her statement.
All right, well, there you have it. That's the United Nations observing and celebrating Mandela Day today. Of course, as we do know, that is where the day was officially declared back in 2009. And of course, we've seen a number of speakers there. The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, basically acknowledging Madiba's struggle against apartheid and really talking about him playing a role in terms of peace here in the continent and around the world, and saying that that's the man who devoted his life to the struggle for the human rights. We've also seen our minister here at home for tourism, Mamoloko Ngubane, really emphasizing the importance of celebrating this day under the theme Action Against Poverty.
Yeah, and the last speaker there, somebody that knew Nelson Mandela very well, Gay McDougall, an international human rights lawyer who's had a stellar career fighting for people's rights and justice. And iconically, if you see the picture,